Hello, and welcome to an episode that talks about liberalization, privatization, and globalization terms related to development. I'm Swati Singh, a media professional for the last 15 years, specialized in mass communication. I have worked as a media professional with the Hindustan Times, the Indian Express, Career Launchers, the Times of India, etc., and have also taught mass media in various universities and colleges, including the Delhi University. Today, we shall be discussing about models of development. We will try to understand the meaning of the terms liberalization, privatization, and globalization. As the world is rapidly changing, so is the concept of development, especially with respect to the context of economic development. And here is where we discuss about the three important terms related to the same, that is liberalization, privatization, and globalization. Today, we shall understand the relevance of these terms to the modern age, and we shall study the various aspects of these as well. First, let's start by discussing the objectives of this episode. The objectives of this lesson are to learn about the concept of liberalization, privatization, and globalization, to learn about the New World Economic Order, to understand a working and role of the World Trade Organization with respect to liberalization, privatization, and globalization, to learn about the definition of liberalization, to understand privatization and its various facets, to learn about the concept of globalization and how it affects our current environment. Let's start with the meaning and concepts of LPG, that is liberalization, privatization, and globalization. So LPG stands for what we talked about: liberalization, privatization, globalization, and India, under its new economic policy, has approached international banks for development of the country. Now, these agencies asked the Indian government to open its restrictions on the trade done by the private sector and between India and the other countries. So, the new economic order, Indian government actually agreed to the conditions of lending agencies and announced a new economic policy, which consisted wide range of reforms. Broadly, we can classify the measures in two groups. So, they were the structural reforms with long-term perspective and eyeing for improvements of the economy and enhancing the international competitiveness. Reforms were made to remove rigidity in various segments of an economy. The second one was stabilization measures. Now, these measures were undertaken to correct the inherent weaknesses that had developed in balance of payments, and these measures were short-term. Various long-term structural reforms were categorized as liberalization, privatization, and globalization. Collectively, they are known as LPG as an acronym. The balance of payments is a system of recording the economic transactions of a country with the rest of the world over a period of 1 year. When the general prices of goods and services are increasing in an economy over a period of time, the same situation is called inflation. Let's understand each terminology in detail, starting with liberalization. The basic aim of liberalization was to put an end to those restrictions which became hindrances in the process of development and growth of the nation. The loosening of government control in a country, and when private sector companies start working without or with fewer restrictions and governments allow private players to expand for the growth of the country, depicts liberalization in a country. Now, what are the objectives of liberalization policy, you may ask? So, it is to increase the competition amongst domestic players. It is to encourage the foreign trade with other countries with regulated imports and exports. It is the enhancement of the foreign capital and technology. It is to expand the global market frontiers of the country. and it is to diminish the burden of the country. Now let's talk about the economic reforms during liberalization. Many sectors were impacted during the course of liberalization. They were the industrial sector reforms, the financial sector reforms, the tax reforms, fiscal reforms, foreign exchange reforms, external sector reforms. So let us discuss all these reforms in detail. Industrial sector reforms. A number of reformative steps were taken to deregulate the industrial sector, like abolition of the industrial licensing. The government abolished the licensing requirements of all industries except for 5 industries, which are liquor, cigarettes, defense equipment, industrial explosive, dangerous chemicals, drugs and pharmaceuticals. Contraction of public sector. A number of public sector industries, which were earlier reserved under the governmental control, are reduced from 17 to 8 in the count. Presently, these companies are only 3 in number. Public sector undertaking controls in the sector mentioned below are railways, atomic energy and defense. De-reservation of production areas. The production areas which were earlier reserved for small-scale industries were de-reserved to all. This improved the land efficiency and developed more cultivation areas across the country. Farmers were earlier restricted to use areas owned by them. Later, during privatization, many private sector organizations entered into the sector of farming. Liberalization technically increased the production per hectare and supported the growth of the nation. Let's talk about the expansion of production capacity. The producers were voluntarily allowed to expand their production capacity according to the nature of the market. They were allowed to choose their own crop or product. On the study of the market conditions related to the demand and supply, the producers were allowed to choose the size of land under cultivation for each crop and had a liberty to plan their production, either for the domestic market or for the international markets. Other products which have acceptability in international markets were allowed to manufacture. Exports were allowed for all types of crops. Imports of latest technology was encouraged to develop more scale in the agriculture sector. Freedom to import capital goods. To upgrade and adopt technology which is more advanced as compared to the existing technology we have, the business houses and production units were allowed to import capital goods from advanced countries. This helped in increasing the percentage cultivation across the country. Farmers and producers of other products were allowed to exchange the technological upgradation. Financial sector reforms. Financial sector includes various financial institutions like the commercial banks, investment banks, stock exchange operators, foreign exchange dealers, etc. These reforms were enforced and initiated in the financial institutes. The first one is reducing various ratios. Statutory liquidity ratio, that is SLR, was lowered from 38.5% to 25%. The cash reserve ratio, or the CRR, was lowered from 15% to 4.1%. Going towards competition from new private banks. The banking sector emerged in the private sector and many players grabbed the opportunity to compete with the public sector banks. This led to a creation of positive competition and expansion of the service sector for the consumers. Next is the change in the role of RBI. The ace bank of the country, that is the Reserve Bank of India, became a facilitator. Earlier, RBI was the regulator of the financial activities in the country. Another step was deregulation on interest rates. Banks were allowed to set their own interest rates on all business and commercial borrowings. But for saving bank deposits, the control was with the central government. Tax reforms or fiscal reforms. Fiscal reforms are the policies set for the government's taxation and public expenditure policies. All macroeconomic related issues are part of the fiscal policies designed by the central government. Prior policies simplifying the tax structure and taxation rates were dropped and reduced for convenience of the taxpayers. This increased the tax revenue for the government and reduced all the tax evasion strategies, which taxpayers used to follow to skip tax liability. As the tax revenue and other revenue increased for the government, correspondingly, government started developing all the areas which were either underdeveloped or undeveloped. Another step was the foreign exchange reforms or the external sector reforms. All foreign exchange policies and foreign trade policies were covered in external sector reforms. These were developed to increase the international trade between the countries. Various reforms were initiated in this sector to develop the foreign exchange reserves. Some of the reforms were devaluation of rupee. The value of the rupee was deliberately devalued to encourage exports and discourage imports. In 1991, to increase the foreign exchange reserves, exports were promoted and all relevant benefits were provided to the exporters. Other measures were the quota system was abolished, especially on imports. All import-related policies were trashed. Duties on various imported goods were reduced, and all export duties were withdrawn. Now let's understand the work and the role of the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization was constituted in lieu of the General Agreement on Trade and Tariff, that is GATT. In 1948, GATT was established with an association of 23 countries as a global trade organization to administrate all international and multinational trade agreements by providing equal opportunities to all the countries in international markets to encourage trading between the countries. This led to a few transactional problems, though. Some functions of the WTO we discuss about. The main function of WTO was to administrate trade review mechanism. The World Trade Organization was a facilitator for implementation, operation and administration of all relevant objectives of multilateral trade agreements. World Trade Organization was the administrator of understanding the rules, procedures and governing the settlement disputes. The WTO acted as the watchdog of international trade and ensured that all trade-related rules were followed and examined the trade regimes of individual members as well. The WTO had its own dispute settlement court to resolve all matters which cannot be resolved through bilateral talks and discussions. It is a management consultant in the international market. Then economists at WTO keep a close look at the global economy and provide studies on main issues for the day. Now let's talk about privatization. This is the second of the three policies of liberalization, privatization and globalization. It is the increment of the dominating role of the private sector companies and the reduced role of the public sector companies. In other words, it is a reduction of ownership of the management of government-owned enterprise. Government companies can be converted into private companies in two ways: by disinvestment, by withdrawal of government ownership and management of public sector companies. Now let's come to the forms of privatization. We start with denationalization or strategic sale. When 100% government ownership of productive assets is transferred to the private sector players, the act is called denationalization. Partial privatization or partial sale. When private sector owns more than 50% but less than 100% ownership in a previously constructed public sector company, by transfer of shares, it is called the partial privatization. Here, the private sector owns the majority of the shares. Consequently, the private sector possesses substantial control of the functioning and autonomy of the company. The next way is deficit privatization or token privatization. When the government disinvests its share capital to an extent of 5 to 10% to meet the deficit in the budget, is termed as the deficit privatization. Also, let's understand now the objectives of privatization. So, they are to improve the financial situation of the government. They also help in reducing the workload of the public sector companies. Privatization raises funds from disinvestments. It increases the efficiency of the government organizations and provides better and improved goods and services to the consumers. Also, privatization creates healthy competition in the society and encourages foreign direct investments in India. Now we come to the globalization. This term means to integrate the economy of one country with the global economy. During globalization, the main focus is on foreign trade and private and institutional foreign investment. It is the last policy of liberalization, privatization and globalization to be implemented. Globalization as a term has a very complex phenomena. The main aim is to transform the world towards independence and integration of the world as a whole by settling various strategic policies. Globalization is attempting to create a borderless world wherein the need of one country can be driven from across the globe and turning into one large economy. Let's talk about outsourcing as an outcome of globalization. The most important outcome of the globalization process is outsourcing. During the outsourcing model, a company of a country hires a professional from some other country to get their work done, which was earlier conducted by their internal resources of their own country. The best part of outsourcing is that the work can be done at a lower rate and from the superior source available anywhere in the world. Services like legal advice, marketing, technical support, etc. As information technology has grown in the past few years, the outsourcing of contractual work from one country to another has grown tremendously. As a mode of communication, this arrangement has widened the reach of all economic activities and have expanded globally. Various business process outsourcing companies or call centers as we know them, which have their model of voice-based business processes have developed in India. Activities like accounting and bookkeeping services, clinical advice, banking services or even education are being outsourced from developed countries to India. Let's learn about the various benefits of globalization. So globalization impacts the business in many different ways. But those who decide to take an international expansion find several benefits including access to new cultures. Globalization makes it easier than ever to access foreign culture, including the food, movies, music and art. This free flow of people, goods and art and information is the reason you can have Thai food delivered to your apartment as you listen to your favorite UK-based artist or stream a Bollywood movie. Also, it helps in the spread of technology and innovation. Many countries around the world remain constantly connected these days. So, knowledge and technological advances travel quickly because knowledge also transfers so fast. This means the scientific advancements made in Asia can be at work in the United States of America in a matter of days. Another benefit of globalization is lower cost for products. Globalization allows companies to find lower cost and ways to produce their products. It also increases the global competition, which drives prices down and creates a large variety of choices for the consumers. Lowered costs help people in both developing and already developed countries live better and on less money. Another advantage is the higher standards of living across the globe due to globalization. Developing nations experience an improved standard of living thanks to globalization. According to the World Bank, extreme poverty decreased by 35% since 1990. Further, the target of the first Millennium Development Goal was to cut the 1990 poverty rate in half by 2015. This was achieved 5 years ahead of the schedule in 2010. Across the globe, nearly 1.1 billion people have evolved out of extreme poverty since that time. The another benefit of globalization is access to new markets. Businesses gain a great deal from globalization, including new customers and diverse revenue streams. Companies interested in the benefits look for the flexible and innovative ways to grow their business overseas. International professional employer organizations make it easier than ever to employ workers in other countries quickly. and compliantly. This means that for many companies, there is no longer the need to establish a foreign entity to expand overseas. Another benefit is access to new talent. In addition to the new markets, globalization allows companies to find new specialized talent that is not available in their current market. For example, globalization gives companies the opportunity to explore the tech talent in the booming markets such as Berlin and Stockholm, rather than Silicon Valley. Again, international PEO allows companies to compliantly employ workers overseas without having to establish a legal entity, making global hiring easier than ever. So, what are these challenges of globalization, you may ask? Well, while globalization offers many benefits, it's not without challenges. Velocity Global 2020 State of the Global Expansion Report, technology industry reveals that some of the top challenges that developed countries' tech leaders face when taking their companies global and leaders of other companies likely face the same obstacles. Some of the hurdle companies face when going global include international recruiting. It is not surprising that 30% of the international tech leaders cited international recruiting as the most common challenge. Recruiting across borders creates unknown for HR teams. First, companies create a plan for how they will interview and thoroughly vet candidates to make sure that they are qualified when thousands of miles separate from them and from away from their headquarters. Next, companies need to know that the market demand for the salaries and benefits to make competitive offers. To ensure successful hires, HR teams must factor in challenges like time zones, cultural differences, and language barriers to find a good fit for their company. Another issue is managing employee immigration. Immigration challenges cause a lot of headaches internally, which is why 28% of the developed countries' tech leaders agreed it was one of their top challenges. Immigration laws change often, and in some countries, it is extremely difficult to secure visas for their employees that are foreign nationals. Another problem is incurring tariffs and export fee. The biggest challenge that many tech leaders said they face in the report is incurring tariffs and export fees to 29%. Agreed that this is a challenge for their global businesses. For companies looking to sell products abroad, getting those items overseas can be expensive, depending on the market. Another issue would be payroll and compliance challenges. So, another common global expansion obstacle is managing overseas payrolls and maintaining compliances with changing employment and tax laws. This management task gets even more tedious and difficult if you are trying to manage operations in multiple markets. Loss of cultural identity. While globalization has made foreign countries easier to access, it has also begun to meld unique societies together. The success of certain cultures throughout the world caused other countries to emulate them. But when cultures begin to lose their distinctive features, we lose our global diversity. Another challenge is foreign worker exploitation. Lower costs do benefit many consumers, but it also creates a tough competition that leads to some companies to search for cheap labor sources. Some Western companies ship their production overseas to countries like China and Malaysia, where lax regulation make it easier to exploit the workers. Another problem is the global expansion difficulties. For businesses that want to go global and discover the benefit of globalization, setting up of a compliant overseas presence is difficult. If companies take the traditional route of setting up an entity, they need substantial upfront capital, sometimes up to millions of rupees, and cost of thousands of rupees annually to maintain the business. Additionally, global businesses must keep up with the different and ever-changing labor laws in new countries. When expanding into new countries, companies must be aware of how to navigate new legal systems. Otherwise, missteps lead to impediments and severe financial and legal consequences. Another issue is immigration challenges and local job loss. The political climate in the United States and Europe show that there are different viewpoints on the result of globalization. Many countries around the globe are tightening their immigration rules. It is harder for immigrants to find jobs in new countries. This rise in nationalism is mainly due to the anger from the perception that foreigners fill domestic jobs or at companies moving their operations abroad to save money or labor cost. Let's come to the conclusion. Development is an evident side effect of the varied types of development and growth. Liberalization leads to free markets, where privatization gives more freedom to the private players and takes off some burden off from the government sector. And globalization there creates an interdependent system for working, which makes the world a family and leads to beneficial practice globally. All these work towards improving living standards and thus lead to economic empowerment for all. And now it's time for a quick recap. Today we discussed the various aspects of development with respect to the economic progress. All the models discussed have different operations and also work on certain principles. We started with liberalization and we went on to talk about the privatization and the ways in which it can help the economy. Lastly, we talked only about globalization, rather, we also talked about the various challenges related to globalization. Well, this is all we have for you today. We hope you enjoyed the session. We shall be back very soon with another episode on development. Until then, take care, bye-bye and namaskar.